Every central bank on the planet is doing something right now that they don't want you to understand. Not in a press release, not in a speech, in their actual vaults. And once you see what they're buying and why they've been lying about it for decades, you will never look at the money in your bank account the same way again. Before you keep scrolling, drop a comment with one word: gold or cash. Tell me which one you actually trust right now. The answers are going to be wild. For 5,000 years, without a single meeting, without a shared language, without any coordinated plan, every great civilization on Earth arrived at the same answer. The Egyptians, the Romans, the Chinese dynasties, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, cultures separated by oceans and centuries and entirely different systems of belief, all of them, chose the same thing: gold. That is not sentiment. That is not tradition for its own sake. That is the result of a 5,000-year empirical experiment in which every alternative was tried, and every single alternative eventually failed. Now here is the question that most people never think to ask. If gold is just a shiny metal with no practical use, if it's outdated, if it's irrelevant, if it belongs in museums and not monetary systems, then why right now, in the modern era, with all our digital technology and financial sophistication, are the world's most powerful central banks buying it in the largest quantities ever recorded in modern history? We'll come back to that, because the answer is going to disturb you. Let's start with chemistry, because this is not a sentimental story. This is a scientific one. There are 118 known elements on the periodic table. At some point in human history, societies on every continent face the same problem. How do you store value, facilitate exchange, and measure economic activity across time and distance? How do you create a medium that cannot be easily counterfeited, that does not deteriorate, and that is scarce enough to retain value over generations? They went through the periodic table, in effect, and eliminated everything that didn't qualify. Most elements are too reactive. They corrode, they oxidize, they combine with other materials and lose their properties. Some are toxic, some are too common to be scarce, some are gases at room temperature, several are radioactive. When you filter by the actual requirements, chemical stability, physical workability, natural scarcity, divisibility without loss of properties, you end up with a very small set of candidates. And within that set, gold is uniquely qualified. It does not corrode, it does not tarnish, it does not react with air or water under normal conditions. A gold coin pulled from a shipwreck after 4 centuries on the ocean floor looks essentially the same as the day it was minted. You can divide it into any quantity and each piece retains the same properties as the whole. And it is genuinely, irreversibly scarce. All the gold ever extracted from the earth, every pharaoh's tomb, every central bank vault, every wedding ring and Olympic medal, if melted into a single cube, would fit inside approximately 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. For a planet of 8 billion people, that is a staggeringly small amount of a very specific substance. This is not why humanity chose gold for aesthetic reasons. This is why gold survived 5,000 years of competition, because no other substance on Earth could do what it does. Now let's talk about what gold actually is, because this is the distinction that most people, including most financial professionals, get completely wrong. Gold is not an investment. A rental property generates rent. A stock represents a claim on future corporate earnings. A bond pays interest. These assets have intrinsic productive value. They generate economic output that can be measured and priced. Gold generates nothing. It pays no dividend, it produces no earnings, it sits in a vault and does not change. What gold is, precisely, is money. It is a measuring instrument. It is the device that tells you whether your savings, your salary, your bank balance are actually holding their value or being silently destroyed. And the most important thing you need to understand about gold as money is this: it has not gotten more valuable over long periods of time. What has happened is that everything else has gotten less valuable relative to it. Here's the historical proof. A Roman centurion, a professional soldier of middling rank, earned approximately 1 ounce of gold per month. That wage bought him a quality toga, a leather belt, and sandals. A well-made outfit, the equivalent of a good suit today. 1 ounce of gold at current prices, roughly $4,500 to $5,000, buys you exactly that. A well-made suit, quality shoes, a belt and a shirt, the same purchasing power 2,000 years apart. Gold did not appreciate. Everything else depreciated relative to it. The metal is sitting exactly where it has always been, doing exactly what it has always done, telling the truth about what your currency is actually worth. Now, I need to explain what happened in 1971, because it is the single most consequential monetary event of the past century, and it is almost completely absent from mainstream financial education. And until you understand it, you cannot fully understand inflation, you cannot understand why debt keeps growing, and you cannot understand why central banks are doing what they are doing right now. Before 1971, the US dollar was not simply a piece of paper, it was a receipt, a legal claim on a specific quantity of physical gold. If you held a dollar, you held in principle a right to exchange that dollar for gold at a fixed rate. The dollar was, in a precise sense, a warehouse receipt for a hard asset. This system was formalized at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, when 44 nations agreed that the dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce and every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar. The entire global financial system was anchored to a single physical constraint, the amount of gold the United States held in its vaults. That constraint was also a discipline. If the U.S. government wanted to spend more than it collected in taxes, it had to either raise taxes, issue debt the market would voluntarily buy, or find more gold. It could not simply instruct a central bank to create dollars from nothing, because every additional dollar was supposed to be backed by a proportionate additional quantity of gold. The gold standard was not primarily a mechanism for managing exchange rates. It was a mechanism for constraining government spending. It forced governments to operate within the limits of real resources rather than unlimited monetary creation. The constraint broke down for a reason that is directly relevant to what is happening today. The United States fought an expensive war in Vietnam while simultaneously expanding massive domestic social programs. The combination required more dollars than the gold supply could honestly support. The government was effectively printing more receipts than it had gold to back them with. Other nations noticed. France, under President de Gaulle, explicitly called the bluff. France sent a naval vessel to New York to collect physical gold in exchange for its dollar holdings, which was the contractual right of any sovereign holding dollars under Bretton Woods. Other nations began lining up to do the same. It was a run on the central bank of the world. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon appeared on television and announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. That temporary suspension has now lasted 54 years. It was not temporary, it was permanent. And in that single decision, made unilaterally on a Sunday evening without international consultation, the anchor between money and physical reality was severed forever. From that point forward, the dollar was backed not by gold, but by a promise, by the credibility of the United States government, by what economists call fiat, a Latin word meaning simply "let it be." The dollar has value because the government says it has value. That is the entire foundation of the monetary system you are operating within right now. Here is what that change has produced over 50 years. In 1971, $1 had a specific purchasing power. Today, that same dollar has approximately 7 cents of purchasing power in 1971 terms. 93% of the dollar's value has been destroyed, not by a market crash, not by a single catastrophic event, by the continuous quiet mechanism of money creation, of printing more receipts than the underlying economy generates in real value. In 1981, the broadest measure of U.S. money supply was approximately $860 billion. By 2021, that figure had reached $22 trillion, an increase of more than 25 times in 40 years. During the COVID response alone, the United States printed approximately 40% of all the dollars that had ever existed in history in 18 months. 40% of the entire monetary base, created in a year and a half. The consequence of creating 40% more of any limited supply asset is that each existing unit becomes proportionately less valuable. This is not economic theory, it is arithmetic. When a government creates money to fund spending, whether for wars, stimulus programs, or bank bailouts, that new money gradually raises the price of goods and assets. The people who hold cash, savers, wage earners, retirees on fixed incomes, find that their money buys less. The people who hold real assets, property, equities, commodities, gold, find that the nominal price of those assets rises as the currency used to measure them loses value. Their real wealth has not increased. Their nominal wealth has, while the wealth of pure cash holders is quietly diluted. This is a transfer mechanism. It moves purchasing power from savers to borrowers, from the asset poor to the asset rich, continuously and invisibly, year after year. Inflation is not prices going up, it is your money going down. The distinction matters because it locates the cause correctly. Prices are not rising because goods have become more valuable. They are rising because the currency used to measure their value has become less scarce. Now here is what I consider the most important data point in this entire discussion, and the one that should make every serious person stop and pay attention. For decades, the official position of the world's central banks, the very institutions that print and manage national currencies, was that gold was a barbarous relic, an outdated asset with no place in a modern financial system. A historical curiosity maintained on balance sheets out of tradition rather than function. Finance ministers and central bank governors said these things in speeches and press conferences consistently throughout the 1990s and 2000s. What they were doing with their actual capital told a completely different story. Since approximately 2010, and accelerating dramatically since 2022, central banks globally have been purchasing gold at the highest sustained pace in recorded modern history. Last year, central banks collectively purchased over 1,000 tons. The year before, similarly elevated levels. This is not a rounding error. This is not a statistical artifact. This is a deliberate, policy-driven reallocation of sovereign reserves, away from dollar-denominated assets and toward physical gold. The buyers include Poland, China, India, Brazil, Kazakhstan, and dozens of others. They said gold was irrelevant. They were buying gold by the ton. That gap between what powerful institutions say and what they actually do is one of the most reliable signals in finance. 3 specific motivations are driving this behavior. Understanding all 3 is essential to understanding the structural shift now underway. The first is de-dollarization, the systematic reduction of dependence on the US dollar as the world's primary reserve asset. Dollar reserves as a percentage of global central bank holdings have been declining for over a decade. This is a slow process, not a sudden shift, driven by the rational assessment that overconcentration in any single currency exposes a sovereign to specific and dangerous risks. The second motivation is sanctions risk, and it is the most acute driver of the acceleration since 2022. When the United States and its allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves in response to the Ukraine invasion, they demonstrated something that every sovereign treasury on the planet immediately processed. Dollar-denominated reserves held in Western institutions are subject to political discretion. They can be frozen. They can be effectively seized. The rule of law protection that was the foundational assumption of dollar reserve status was shown to be conditional on geopolitical alignment. Gold held physically in domestic vaults cannot be frozen by a foreign government's executive order. It cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be made to disappear by a digital instruction to a correspondent bank. For every sovereign with any uncertainty about its long-term relationship with Washington, the risk calculus changed permanently in February 2022. The third motivation is the debt arithmetic. Central bank analysts can read balance sheets. They can see that the United States is adding approximately $1 trillion to its national debt every 100 days. They can calculate the trajectory of interest payments relative to tax revenue. They can model the scenarios in which a government carrying $40 trillion of debt with a structurally growing deficit resolves that tension. And they can observe that the politically viable resolution paths all involve some degree of currency debasement. Gold is the hedge against that outcome, not a bet on catastrophe. Insurance against the known direction of the system's long-term drift. The convergence now visible in market data is historically unusual. Central banks buying at record pace. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and UBS publishing bullish structural price targets. Physical demand in coins and bars elevated globally, and the divergence between paper gold prices and physical market signals continues to widen, suggesting the paper market is increasingly disconnected from the physical reality of supply and demand. When the institutions with the deepest analytical resources and the longest investment horizons converge on the same asset simultaneously, that convergence deserves serious attention, not as a trade signal, but as a structural observation about where sophisticated capital is moving and why. Here is the framework that I think is most useful for thinking about this in your own financial life. Gold is not a growth investment in the conventional sense. It does not generate cash flow. It does not compound. It does not reward you for holding it the way an equity does. What it does is protect you against the specific risk that is most consistently underestimated by ordinary savers, the long-term erosion of purchasing power through currency debasement. The risk of keeping savings in a deposit account earning 2 or 3% while real experienced inflation runs considerably higher is not visible on a daily basis. It does not generate headlines. It works silently, compounding backward, reducing what your saved labor can purchase year after year. The dollar worth 100 cents in 1971 is worth 7 cents today. That is not an anomaly. That is the expected long-term performance of an unbacked fiat currency managed by a government with structural incentives to spend beyond its means. Gold maintains purchasing power across the debasement cycle, not because it appreciates in real terms, but because it holds its real value while the currency denominating it loses its own. The centurion's ounce of gold bought a quality outfit 2,000 years ago. It buys a quality outfit today, not performance. Stability. A stability that no fiat currency in all of recorded history has ever maintained over comparable timeframes. Sovereign wealth funds and family offices typically maintain 5 to 15% allocations to gold as a structural position, not as the engine of growth, but as insurance against the known direction of the system's drift. That insurance has historically been worth paying for continuously, rather than trying to time around market events. I track this data every single day, and what I'm watching right now in the physical gold market is something I haven't seen before. Something I'll be breaking down in detail in tomorrow's update. Make sure you're here for it. What I am confident about is this. The 50-year experiment in unbacked fiat currency is producing exactly the outcomes the historical record would predict. Purchasing power erosion, growing debt, monetary accommodation as the path of least resistance, central banks quietly accumulating the asset they publicly dismissed as obsolete, investment banks raising gold price targets while simultaneously advising clients to hold more of the very currency gold is measuring. Gold is, in the precise sense, a 5,000-year-old truth detector for governments. It does not respond to press conferences. It does not care about official inflation statistics or central bank credibility statements. It reflects, slowly and over time, the actual relationship between the amount of currency in circulation and the amount of real value it claims to represent. When gold rises in price terms, it is not gold that is rising. It is the currency that is falling. The metal is simply sitting where it has always been, doing what it has always done, telling the truth about what the paper in your pocket is actually worth. Understanding that distinction is the beginning of understanding money. And understanding money is the most practically important thing you can do for the long-term protection of everything you have spent your life building. If this changed how you think about money, tell me in the comments. Are you holding cash or are you holding real assets right now? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. And if you want this kind of analysis delivered to you daily, not weekly, not monthly, hit subscribe. No fluff, no hype, just the signals that actually matter.